Every single frame of a Disney movie contains secrets. Not the obvious ones everyone talks about, not Mickey Mouse hidden in the background or the Pizza Planet truck parked somewhere in the corner. We're talking about something far more sophisticated, something that's been hiding in plain sight for decades. Disney animators don't just draw characters moving from point A to point B. They embed psychological profiles, relationship dynamics, and narrative foreshadowing into every single movement, every blink, every breath. What most people see as simple cartoon animals walking around is actually an intricate web of visual storytelling that operates on a level most viewers never consciously notice. Think about this. Disney has been perfecting character animation for nearly a century. They've had access to the world's best animators, unlimited budgets, and frame-by-frame control over every detail. Do you really think they'd waste that power on simple entertainment? The Lion King alone contains over 100,000 individual drawings. Each one was deliberate, each one was planned. And when you start looking at these drawings the way animators see them, not as moving pictures, but as psychological blueprints, patterns emerge that completely change how you understand these stories. Consider the concept of secondary animation, the subtle movements that happen automatically when a character moves. When Simba runs, his mane bounces. When Scar walks, his shoulders roll in a specific way. When Mufasa speaks, his facial muscles contract in precise sequences. These aren't accidents, they're choices. Calculated decisions made by teams of artists who studied real animal behavior, human psychology, and movement theory for years. But here's where it gets interesting. Sometimes these secondary animations don't match what the character is saying or doing in the scene. Sometimes they tell a completely different story. Watch Scar during the Be Prepared sequence. Everyone focuses on the obvious imagery, the Nazi-inspired choreography, the green lighting, the dramatic poses. But look at his micro-expressions. Between his major facial movements, there are tiny animations. A slight twitch around his eyes, the way his ears position themselves, how his breathing pattern changes when he mentions certain words. These micro-animations reveal something the main story never explicitly states. Scar is terrified of his own plan. This isn't speculation. This is how Disney trains their animators. They study what psychologists call leakage, the unconscious physical behaviors that reveal true emotional states. Then they deliberately animate these behaviors into their characters to create subconscious emotional responses in viewers. The technique is called emotional priming, and Disney has been using it since Snow White. They animate characters to display subtle emotional cues that prepare audiences to feel specific ways about upcoming story beats. The viewer's brain picks up on these cues unconsciously, creating emotional investment without the viewer understanding why they feel so connected to animated characters. But this raises an uncomfortable question. If Disney can make audiences feel emotions through subliminal animation techniques, what else might they be communicating through these hidden visual channels? The answer lies in the details that 99% of viewers never notice. The background animations that continue even when the camera isn't focused on them. The way characters move when they think no one is watching. The micro-expressions that contradict what characters are saying out loud. When you start analyzing Disney films frame by frame, looking specifically for these hidden animation layers, you discover something remarkable. Disney has been telling parallel stories. Stories within stories. Stories that exist entirely in the animation choices, separate from the dialogue and obvious plot points. These parallel stories reveal character motivations that the scripts never explicitly state. They show relationship dynamics that contradict what characters claim about each other. They foreshadow plot developments that won't become obvious until much later in the film, or sometimes not until sequels that wouldn't be made for years. The Lion King is particularly rich with these hidden animation stories, partly because animal characters allow for more sophisticated movement vocabulary than human characters. Every ear position, tail movement, and walking gait carries specific meaning in animal psychology. Disney's animators researched this extensively, then used it to encode information that operates below the conscious viewing level. This isn't conspiracy theory, this is documented animation technique. Disney's own training materials discuss these methods. The question isn't whether they're doing it. The question is how far they've taken it, and what stories they're really telling through these hidden channels. Let's start with something that seems completely innocent. The way Scar walks. Most viewers see a villain strutting around with typical bad guy swagger. But Disney's animators created something far more sophisticated. Scar's walking animation contains three distinct phases that correspond to his psychological evolution throughout the film. And these phases begin long before his villainy becomes obvious to other characters. In early scenes, Scar walks with what animators call compensatory swagger. His shoulders roll more than necessary, his steps are slightly wider than biomechanically efficient, and his head positioning is artificially elevated. These aren't signs of confidence, they're textbook indicators of overcompensation. The animation is telling us that Scar feels inferior and is working overtime to project strength. But watch what happens during the stampede sequence. When Scar's alone climbing up to where Mufasa is hanging, his walk cycle completely changes. The compensatory movements disappear. His shoulders drop into natural alignment. His steps become precise and efficient, and his head positioning shifts to what animal behaviorists recognize as hunting posture. This is the real Scar, the calculated predator. The previous swagger was performance art for an audience. When he thinks no one is watching, including the audience, the mask drops, and the animation reveals his true psychological state. The most disturbing detail? This hunting walk appears in tiny glimpses throughout the entire first act of the film. If you watch Scar's background movements when he's not the focus of a scene, you'll catch 2 to 3 frame sequences where he slips into this authentic movement pattern. Disney animated Scar's true nature into moments when the audience's attention was directed elsewhere. This technique appears throughout Disney's catalog, but it's particularly sophisticated in The Lion King because the animators had access to extensive research on predator psychology from wildlife documentaries. Mufasa's mane animation tells an equally complex story. Most viewers assume the mane just moves with wind and general physics. But Disney's animators created what they internally called emotional mapping for Mufasa's mane movement. When Mufasa is confident and secure, his mane moves as a single unit, flowing, unified gestures that suggest controlled power. But watch carefully during his conversation with Zazu about Scar's absence from the ceremony. Mufasa's mane begins moving in separated sections, different areas responding to air currents at slightly different times. The unity breaks down into individual strands that move independently. This isn't random animation. This reflects a psychological state called cognitive fragmentation. When someone's mental focus is divided between multiple concerns, Mufasa's mane animation is revealing that he's worried about more than just Scar's disrespect. He's processing multiple threat scenarios simultaneously. The fragmentation peaks during the conversation where Mufasa explains the past kings to Simba. Watch Mufasa's mane during the phrase, "We are all connected in the great circle of life." The individual mane strands actually move in opposing directions, some flowing forward, others backward, some lifting while others fall. The animation is showing us that Mufasa knows something about the circle of life that he's not telling Simba, something that creates internal conflict between his role as father and his knowledge as king. Simba's movement evolution is even more sophisticated. Disney animators created what they called growth mapping, deliberately changing Simba's movement patterns to reflect psychological development in ways that mirror real animal maturation, but accelerated and psychologically enhanced. Cub Simba moves with what animal psychologists call play aggression, pouncing, bouncing, exaggerated gestures that test physical capabilities without serious intent. But if you track his movement frame by frame, you'll notice that his play aggression is asymmetrical. He favors his right side for physical movements and his left side for investigative behaviors. This asymmetry reflects brain hemisphere development patterns that Disney's animators researched in collaboration with child development specialists. The right favored physical play indicates developing spatial intelligence, while the left favored investigation suggests emerging analytical thinking. Simba isn't just playing, he's developing the cognitive toolkit he'll need as an adult ruler. After the stampede, Simba's movement patterns change dramatically. The asymmetry disappears almost completely. He begins moving with bilateral symmetry, equal favoring of both sides for all activities. In animal development, this pattern typically indicates trauma response. The brain stops specialized hemisphere development and shifts into survival mode. But here's the detail that changes everything. During the Hakuna Matata sequence, Simba's asymmetrical play patterns gradually return. Not the same patterns as before. He now favors his left side for physical movements and his right side for investigative behaviors, the complete opposite of his cub patterns. This reversal isn't arbitrary. It suggests that Simba's brain architecture fundamentally changed during his trauma. He's not just growing up, he's developing into a completely different type of thinker than he would have become without the tragedy. The implications are staggering when you consider that Disney created these movement patterns deliberately. They were telling a story about how trauma reshapes neural development, encoded entirely in animation choices that most viewers process unconsciously. But perhaps the most sophisticated character animation appears in moments when characters think they're unobserved. Disney animators created what they called background psychology, authentic behavioral patterns that characters display when they're not actively performing for other characters or the audience. Watch Scar during crowd scenes. When the focus is on other characters, Scar's facial expressions cycle through micro-emotions that contradict his performed personality. Brief flashes of vulnerability, uncertainty, even what appears to be genuine affection when looking at certain Pride members. These emotions last only 3 to 4 frames, too brief for conscious processing, but long enough to register subconsciously. The same technique appears with other characters. Zazu displays moments of deep sadness when he thinks no one is watching. Rafiki shows flashes of intense anger that contradict his wise mentor image. Even Timon and Pumbaa have background emotional moments that suggest their comedy is partially performative, a coping mechanism covering deeper psychological complexity. Disney was animating the difference between public persona and private emotional reality. They were showing audiences that every character has hidden depths, internal conflicts, and authentic emotions that exist separate from their story function. This raises an uncomfortable question about viewer manipulation. If Disney can encode complex psychological information into character movements that audiences process unconsciously, what other information might they be transmitting through these hidden channels? While audiences focus on main characters, Disney's background artists were encoding an entirely different story into the environments themselves. Every rock formation, every plant placement, every cloud pattern was deliberately designed to communicate information that the dialogue never explicitly states. Pride Rock isn't just a dramatic setting, it's a geological timeline that reveals the true history of the Pride Lands. Look carefully at the rock layers visible in establishing shots. Disney's background artists didn't create a random cliff face. They consulted with geological consultants to design rock stratification that tells a specific story about environmental history. The lower layers show sedimentary deposits consistent with ancient lake beds. The middle layers display volcanic rock formations. The upper layers return to sedimentary patterns but with different mineral compositions. This geological sequence reveals that the Pride Lands have experienced multiple climate cycles, periods of abundant water, volcanic activity, and drought. But here's the crucial detail. The volcanic layer is relatively thin compared to the sedimentary layers above and below it. This suggests a brief but intense period of upheaval followed by recovery. Disney was encoding the information that the Pride Lands have survived catastrophic events before. The kingdom's stability isn't guaranteed, it's cyclical. Pride Rock itself is visual evidence that the land has endured previous disasters and rebuilt stronger. But the geological storytelling goes deeper. Notice the cave paintings visible in brief background shots during Rafiki's scenes. Most viewers assume these are generic ancient drawings, but Disney's artists created specific iconography that corresponds to the geological timeline encoded in Pride Rock's structure. The cave paintings depict what appear to be different eras of leadership, marked by different environmental conditions. Some paintings show lions during green, abundant periods. Others show lions during what appears to be volcanic or fire-based disasters. The paintings suggest that the Pride Lands have experienced cycles of prosperity and catastrophe that correspond to different royal lineages. This background detail completely recontextualizes Scar's reign. He's not just a bad king who happened to cause drought and famine. He's the latest in a cyclical pattern where certain types of leadership correlate with environmental disaster. The geological and artistic evidence suggests this has happened before, and it will happen again. The plant life tells an even more sophisticated story. Disney's botanical consultants created what they called ecosystem mapping, plant growth and decay patterns that reflect both environmental conditions and the emotional states of the characters who interact with those environments. During Mufasa's reign, background plants display what botanists recognize as stable succession growth, diverse species and balanced competition, with healthy root systems and natural seasonal cycles. But if you track the plant life frame by frame throughout the film, you'll notice that decay patterns begin appearing around vegetation near Scar long before he becomes king. This isn't just artistic foreshadowing. Disney was suggesting that Scar's psychological state affects the environment around him. Plants near Scar show signs of stress. Browning edges, drooping posture, accelerated life cycle patterns that indicate the vegetation is trying to complete reproduction before anticipated environmental disaster. The implication is that the land itself can sense Scar's destructive nature. The environmental collapse during his reign wasn't caused by his poor leadership decisions. It was inevitable because the ecosystem was already responding to his presence. This botanical psychology extends to other characters. Plants around Rafiki display unusual growth patterns. Species blooming out of season, vines growing in geometrically impossible spirals, flowers displaying color variations that don't occur in nature. The vegetation around Rafiki behaves as if it's responding to some form of energy that enhances natural processes. Even more disturbing, plants around the graveyard where Scar leads the hyenas show growth patterns consistent with soil contamination. The vegetation displays the kind of adaptive mutations that occur when plants need to survive in toxically altered environments. Disney was suggesting that Scar's influence actually changes the chemical composition of the soil. Weather patterns provide another layer of hidden storytelling. Disney's meteorological consultants created cloud formations, wind patterns, and atmospheric conditions that correspond to character emotional states in ways that mirror real atmospheric psychology research. During Simba's "I just can't wait to be king" sequence, the cloud formations display what meteorologists call unstable equilibrium. Cloud shapes that look stable but are actually in rapid transition. The clouds appear solid and defined, but they're changing shape continuously in ways that suggest imminent atmospheric disruption. This visual metaphor was telling audiences that Simba's carefree childhood was fundamentally unstable. The environmental conditions were already in place for dramatic change, even during moments of apparent happiness and security. The wind patterns tell an equally sophisticated story. During conversations between Mufasa and Scar, wind direction shifts correspond to psychological power dynamics between the characters. When Mufasa has psychological advantage, wind moves from Pride Rock outward toward the kingdom. When Scar gains psychological ground, wind patterns reverse and flow toward Pride Rock from the borderlands. This wind psychology reaches peak sophistication during the stampede sequence. The dust clouds don't just follow realistic physics. They move in patterns that create subliminal visual suggestions about character relationships and emotional states. The dust forms temporary shapes that resemble other characters, creating unconscious associations between the tragedy and specific individuals. But perhaps the most sophisticated background detail appears in crowd scene animations. Disney created what they called social mapping, background character movements that reveal complex social hierarchies and relationship dynamics that the main story never explicitly addresses. Watch the animal movements during the opening ceremony. The gathering isn't random. Different species cluster in specific patterns that correspond to real savanna social structures, but with modifications that suggest artificial political arrangements. Predator and prey species intermingle in ways that don't occur naturally, indicating that Pride Rock's influence creates unnatural peace. But look more carefully at individual animal behaviors within these unnatural groupings. Prey animals display constant micro-movements, ear positioning, head turns, weight shifting, that indicate maintained alertness despite the peaceful setting. They're participating in the ceremony, but their bodies remain prepared for immediate escape. This suggests that Pride Rock's peace is maintained through careful political balance rather than genuine harmony. The animals trust the system enough to participate, but not enough to truly relax. They're constantly ready for the arrangement to collapse. The social mapping becomes even more complex during Scar's reign. The animal gatherings during Be Prepared show completely different movement patterns. Species segregation returns to natural patterns, but with the addition of artificial hierarchies based on political alliance rather than ecological relationships. Disney was showing audiences that Scar's leadership style returns the kingdom to natural predator-prey dynamics, but corrupted by political manipulation. The result is neither natural harmony nor artificial peace. It's systematized exploitation. These background details fundamentally change how we understand the story being told. The conflict between Mufasa and Scar isn't just personal rivalry, it's a clash between different approaches to managing complex ecological and social systems. The environment itself is a character with agency, responding to leadership styles and psychological influences in ways that affect the entire kingdom's stability. But this raises a disturbing question. If Disney encoded this level of sophisticated environmental and social commentary into background details that most viewers never consciously notice, what other information might they be transmitting through these hidden visual channels? When you start examining Disney's animation techniques across multiple films, patterns emerge that suggest something far more coordinated than individual movie production. The same psychological animation methods, environmental storytelling techniques, and character movement vocabularies appear across decades of Disney films. But they're evolving, becoming more sophisticated with each iteration. The Lion King wasn't Disney's first experiment with subliminal character psychology. It was the culmination of techniques they'd been developing and refining since the 1930s. Look at the way Scar's compensatory swagger compares to similar movements in earlier Disney villains. Jafar displays nearly identical shoulder positioning and artificially elevated head carriage. The Evil Queen shows the same asymmetrical weight distribution that suggests psychological overcompensation. Even Captain Hook exhibits the precise walking pattern that Disney's animators would later perfect in Scar. But here's what makes this significant. These villains were animated by different teams, in different decades, using different technologies. The consistency isn't accidental, it's systematic. Disney developed a standardized vocabulary of psychological movement patterns and taught it across generations of animators. The technique appears in hero characters too. Simba's trauma-induced bilateral movement symmetry mirrors almost exactly the movement changes in Bambi after his mother's disappearance. Both characters shift from asymmetrical play patterns to symmetrical survival movements, then gradually develop new asymmetrical patterns that reflect their changed psychological architecture. This suggests Disney identified specific movement signatures that correspond to particular psychological states, then systematically applied these signatures across their character library. They weren't just animating individual stories. They were building a comprehensive visual language for communicating psychological information. The environmental storytelling techniques show even more sophisticated evolution across films. The geological timeline encoding in Pride Rock builds directly on environmental storytelling methods that first appeared in Snow White's forest environments. The Enchanted Forest shows similar geological stratification that suggests historical cycles of magical and non-magical periods. Both environments use plant life to reflect character psychology, but The Lion King's botanical mapping is far more advanced than Snow White's simpler plants droop when evil is near approach. Disney spent 50 years developing increasingly sophisticated methods for encoding psychological and historical information into environmental details. But the most revealing connections appear in character design elements that repeat across supposedly unconnected films. Specific facial structure ratios, eye positioning mathematics, and color palette combinations appear in characters from different movies who serve similar psychological functions in their respective stories. Scar's facial geometry, the ratio between eye spacing, muzzle length, and ear positioning, appears with minor variations in multiple Disney villains across decades. Not similar designs, but mathematically identical proportions, adjusted for different species and art styles. Disney developed specific geometric formulas that reliably trigger psychological responses in viewers, then applied these formulas systematically. The hero designs show the same mathematical consistency. Simba's adult facial proportions match golden ratio calculations that appear in human Disney heroes dating back to Prince Charming. Mufasa's facial geometry corresponds to mathematical ratios that Disney developed for authority figure characters and applied across species and time periods. This mathematical approach to character design reveals something crucial about Disney's intentions. They weren't creating characters based on artistic inspiration or storytelling needs. They were engineering psychological responses using geometric formulas designed to trigger specific emotional reactions in viewers. The color psychology shows even more systematic development. Scar's color palette, the specific combinations of browns, grays, and black, with particular saturation and value relationships, appears in modified forms across Disney's villain library. But it's not just similar colors. It's mathematically precise color relationships designed to trigger subconscious associations with danger, disease, and decay. Disney's color psychologists developed what they called emotional color mapping, specific color combinations that reliably produce particular emotional states in viewers. These color maps appear consistently across films, creating subconscious connections between characters who serve similar psychological functions in different stories. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery appears in background character design. Secondary characters, animals in crowd scenes, background figures, environmental characters, display design elements that suggest they exist in a shared universe rather than separate story worlds. Look carefully at the background animals during The Lion King's opening ceremony. Some of these character designs appear with minor modifications in other Disney films. Not Easter eggs or cameos, but actual character models that suggest these animals exist across multiple Disney properties. The implications are staggering. If background characters exist across films, it suggests Disney's animated movies don't take place in separate fictional worlds. They're all part of a connected universe with shared history, geography, and population. This theory gains support when you examine the technological evolution of Disney's animation techniques. Each film introduces new methods for psychological manipulation and environmental storytelling, but these methods then appear in subsequent films with increased sophistication. Disney isn't just making individual movies. They're conducting ongoing research into viewer psychology and refining their techniques with each release. The Lion King represents a particularly significant evolution in this research. It's the first Disney film to fully integrate character psychology, environmental storytelling, mathematical character design, and color psychology into a unified system. Every previous technique Disney developed appears in The Lion King in its most advanced form. But The Lion King also introduces new techniques that don't appear in earlier films. The geological timeline encoding, botanical psychology, and social mapping systems are innovations that suggest Disney's psychological manipulation methods were becoming increasingly sophisticated. This raises uncomfortable questions about Disney's ultimate objectives. If they've spent decades developing increasingly advanced methods for communicating information below the conscious viewing level, what information are they trying to transmit? What psychological responses are they trying to engineer? And why do these techniques keep evolving toward greater sophistication rather than simple entertainment? The answer might lie in examining not just what Disney shows us, but what they consistently avoid showing. Across decades of films, certain character types, psychological states, and story elements are systematically excluded from Disney's animated universe. This absence pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. Disney has created a psychological manipulation system disguised as family entertainment. But the manipulation isn't random. It's directed towards specific psychological outcomes. The question isn't whether Disney is influencing viewer psychology. The question is what kind of psychological transformation they're trying to achieve, and whether they've succeeded. After analyzing thousands of animation frames, character movement patterns, environmental details, and cross-film connections, a single theory emerges that explains everything we've discovered. Disney hasn't been making animated movies. They've been conducting the largest psychological conditioning experiment in human history. Consider the scope of what we've uncovered. Systematic character movement vocabularies designed to communicate psychological states below conscious awareness. Environmental storytelling that encodes complex social and historical information into background details. Mathematical character design formulas engineered to trigger specific emotional responses. Color psychology systems that create subconscious associations across multiple films. And background elements that suggest all Disney properties exist within a connected universe with shared psychological rules. This isn't accidental sophistication. This is deliberate psychological architecture. But here's what makes this theory truly disturbing. Disney has been perfecting these techniques for nearly a century, applying them to content specifically designed for children during their most psychologically formative years. The human brain's pattern recognition systems are most malleable between ages 3 to 12, exactly Disney's primary target demographic. Every technique we've identified operates below the conscious viewing level. Children watching these films absorb psychological information, character relationship models, and environmental conditioning without realizing they're being taught anything beyond simple entertainment. Their developing brains integrate these patterns as fundamental reality rather than fictional storytelling. The mathematical character design formulas are particularly revealing. Disney developed specific geometric ratios that reliably trigger emotional responses. But these ratios don't just influence how viewers feel about animated characters. They establish psychological templates for how viewers evaluate real people who display similar geometric relationships. Children who grow up watching Disney films learn to associate specific facial proportions with trustworthiness, authority, danger, or desirability. These associations operate automatically, influencing social interactions, relationship choices, and leadership evaluation throughout their adult lives. Disney isn't just entertaining children, they're programming fundamental social perception algorithms. The environmental storytelling techniques have even broader implications. Children absorb Disney's encoded information about social hierarchies, environmental relationships, and political systems as natural law rather than artistic choice. They develop unconscious expectations about how societies should function based on the social mapping patterns embedded in Disney's crowd scenes and environmental interactions. The geological timeline encoding teaches children that environmental disaster and recovery follow predictable cycles tied to leadership quality. This creates psychological preparation for accepting environmental catastrophe as inevitable rather than preventable, a mindset that influences environmental policy attitudes throughout their adult lives. But the most significant implication emerges from the cross-film connection patterns. If Disney's animated properties exist within a shared psychological universe, then children aren't just learning individual story lessons. They're absorbing a comprehensive worldview system that spans multiple narratives and reinforces consistent psychological frameworks. This worldview system includes specific models for how authority figures should behave and be evaluated, what personality traits indicate trustworthiness or danger, how environmental and social systems naturally function, what kinds of problems require individual versus collective solutions, how historical cycles of prosperity and disaster operate, what emotional responses are appropriate for different situations. Children who internalize this worldview system develop psychological frameworks that persist throughout their adult lives, influencing political beliefs, social relationships, environmental attitudes, and personal decision-making in ways they never consciously recognize. The conditioning is remarkably comprehensive. Disney has encoded information about virtually every aspect of social and environmental interaction into their animation techniques. Children absorb this information as entertainment, but their brains process it as fundamental reality programming. This explains why Disney characters and stories maintain such powerful emotional resonance throughout people's adult lives. The characters aren't just nostalgic memories. They're embedded psychological templates that continue influencing behavior and perception decades after initial exposure. But this raises the ultimate question. What kind of society does Disney's psychological conditioning system create? Look at the consistent patterns across Disney's psychological programming. Authority figures are either benevolent patriarchs who deserve complete trust or obvious villains who deserve complete rejection. Complex authority figures who display both positive and negative traits are systematically excluded from Disney's character vocabulary. Environmental problems are always solved through individual heroism rather than collective action or systemic change. Social conflicts are resolved through personal transformation rather than structural reform. Historical disasters are presented as natural cycles rather than preventable consequences of specific decisions. Disney's psychological conditioning system creates adults who expect simple authority relationships, individual solutions to collective problems, and cyclical rather than progressive approaches to social and environmental challenges. It produces citizens who are psychologically prepared to accept authoritarian leadership as long as it presents itself with the right geometric facial proportions and emotional performance patterns. The system also creates consumers who maintain emotional attachment to Disney properties throughout their adult lives, ensuring continued psychological reinforcement and commercial engagement across multiple generations. This isn't necessarily malicious intent. Disney's psychological conditioning system might be an unintended consequence of increasingly sophisticated entertainment production techniques. But the effects remain the same regardless of intent. Millions of people worldwide have been psychologically conditioned by Disney's animation techniques without realizing it. Their fundamental assumptions about social relationships, environmental systems, and political authority have been shaped by subliminal information encoded in children's entertainment. The question isn't whether this conditioning has occurred, the evidence is overwhelming. The question is what we do with this knowledge. Once you understand how Disney's psychological manipulation techniques operate, you can't unsee them. Every character movement, environmental detail, and design choice becomes visible as deliberate psychological programming rather than innocent entertainment. This knowledge fundamentally changes how you interpret not just Disney films, but all visual media. You begin recognizing similar psychological manipulation techniques in advertising, political communication, news media, and other entertainment properties. You realize that subliminal psychological programming through visual media is far more widespread than most people imagine. But perhaps the most important implication is personal. If your fundamental psychological frameworks were shaped by Disney's conditioning system, how much of your adult personality, relationships, and worldview represents your authentic self versus embedded programming? How many of your political beliefs, social attitudes, and personal preferences trace back to psychological templates you absorbed from animated characters during childhood? How much of what you consider your natural personality is actually the result of systematic conditioning you never consciously experienced? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary questions if we want to understand the true impact of sophisticated psychological manipulation disguised as entertainment. Disney created something unprecedented in human history, a psychological conditioning system that operates globally, across cultures, and spans multiple generations. The implications of this system are still unfolding, but one thing is certain. It has fundamentally altered human consciousness in ways we're only beginning to understand. The next time you watch a Disney film, remember, you're not just seeing a story. You're experiencing the most sophisticated psychological manipulation system ever created. And now that you know it exists, you can never quite see it the same way again.